everyone, it's Mattea with the Sierra Club Grand Canyon chapter, aka the Arizona chapter. I am our Grand Canyon program manager, and I'm based out of the unceded homelands of over 13 tribal nations in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I'm so excited to welcome you to Land Defenders, a podcast dedicated to the voices, stories, and wisdom rooted in the lands of the greater Grand Canyon region. Here, on land sacred to many indigenous peoples, each stone, river, mountain, and canyon wall holds stories of connection, reverence, and defense. In each episode, we challenge the forces threatening this living ecosystem and elevate the stories of those defending its future. From activists and elders to water protectors and land defenders, we're here to share the truth, confront injustice, and explore the deep-rooted connections that tie culture to conservation. Join us as we move beyond the rim and into the heart of the work to protect this region. Up next, you're about to listen to an episode in a series that we developed in partnership with 3 students from NAU focused on Snowbowl Ski Resort and the agencies that are supposed to hold them accountable. A few updates. The student semester has finished, so I will be taking over the podcast from here, and you will notice that audio is getting better throughout the series. This is a really grassroots project, and we're learning a lot along the way. Anywho, enough with that. I am really excited for y'all to listen to this episode with Dr. Jocks. He is quite an expert on the legal history related to and affecting the crisis on the peaks as it relates to Snowbowl. This episode will hopefully help you to understand how the heck Snowbowl was even allowed to exist on such a sensitive and sacred place, why certain legal actions have not worked, and how other legal cases that from the outside may seem unrelated have seriously affected the issues on the peaks. Without further ado, this is part 2 of a 2-part episode with Dr. Jocks. If you haven't listened to part 1, definitely check that out first.
That brings me to an event in the next phase of the story that I want people to know about. I always tell students about this when I bring this up in a class. So once that ruling was made, a lot of Native people felt like, okay, it's gone all the way up, as far as it's going to go legally, we're stuck with this for now. They were also saying that lease for the treated wastewater with the city of Flagstaff will come up for renewal in 2034. So let's get ready for that. In the meantime, it didn't seem like there were too many options. Hopi Tribe filed 2 more lawsuits under Arizona state law in 2013. Those cases both lost at the Arizona Supreme Court level. And I have to acknowledge that, Sean Mulford, who alerted me to this, that during the time when I was involved with efforts here in Flagstaff to establish an Indigenous community center here in Flagstaff with the city of Flagstaff. City staff were working with us to try to explore what that might look like. After the Ninth Circuit ruling, things got a little, there were annual protests against the opening of Snowbowl, but legally speaking, there didn't seem to be much more left to be done. An issue came up, I think it was 2020, about Arizona Snowbowl. Arizona Snowbowl wanted to expand and one of their ski lifts and up on the mountain. This was going to go beyond the version of that ski lift that had been approved and permitted in the record of decision back in the EIS. So public comments were elicited on that, and medicine people in particular objected to it because they were already recognized under National Historic Preservation Act as traditional authorities, the Forest Service was required to hold a meeting and hear their objections to the expansion of this lift. I forget the name of it. I think it was Agassiz. Huh? So I was busy teaching at NAU, and then one Friday morning I got a call from a medicine man who did work with us in my department. About 7:30 in the morning, he called and said, "Hey, I think there's a meeting you should be at Forest Service headquarters." And I said, "Okay, it's about the peaks." "Sure, I'll go. When is it?" "It's about an hour." So I went, I got dressed and showed up. And this was that meeting. And there were representatives of 2 different Navajo medicine associations that were there to give their testimony. And they had all invited a lot of people to show up. More than Forest Service had counted on. We were in a pretty small meeting room, so we were all packed in there. It was not a public comment occasion, so the rest of us weren't going to have time to speak. But the listed speakers were going to speak, and they were speaking about the medicinal plants that would be harmed because the expanded platform at the top of that lift was in an area where some of these plants exist. But the gentleman that gave me a call was the last speaker, and the way the meeting was set up, too much time was spent with introductions. It was a short enough time to begin with. He had like 15 minutes to talk. And I'm thinking, as somebody who studies how things are done and, power relations and structure and, public structure, structures of public meetings, like, this is ridiculous. They're making it impossible for our side to adequately explain ourselves. Nonetheless, this gentleman got up and the way I can only think of a baseball analogy, he hit it out of the park. In English, you're expecting a medicine man whose world is in the language to explain to a bunch of bureaucrats, including Laura Jo West, the new supervisor of Coconino National Forest. She was leading the meeting. She was relatively new in her job. To explain in 15 minutes why this is important. When he finished, there was total silence in that room. And Laura Jo West, whom I hadn't even met yet, got up, and we laugh about it now because she was trying in some way to say that she was actually moved by what she had heard. And I think she said something like, "I will try to have an Indigenous lens as we make our decision." And of course, I've got it takes more than 15 minutes to develop that, but it was clear to me that I believed her. Not everybody in the room believed her, but I did. Well, fast forward almost a year, Snowbowl submitted their new master development plan. That was 2020, yeah. And Laura Jo West did something that had not been done before when the 2002 Master Development Plan had been submitted. I've seen the letter. She wrote back to Arizona Snowbowl Resort and said, "We have received your Master Development Plan. The environmental review process will begin when you have sent us a revised plan that shows the results of your consultation with Indigenous people." You can't imagine how unprecedented that is in this national forest. It may be common in other national forests, but not in this one. In 2002, they were given the fastest green light possible. We'll get this environmental thing done as quickly as possible. You got nothing to worry about. Not this time. And I attribute that to that meeting. And that means that to this day, this is now 2024, Forest Service has still not initiated an environmental review process which is the next step. That master development plan is still sitting on the shelf. That's 4 years. That's significant. Nonetheless, there was an impact on her career because almost immediately the Forest Service complained, or not the Forest Service, the Arizona Snowbowl Resort complained to her supervisor for the Southwest region that she had taken actions that demonstrated bias in favor of the tribes. It would be such a piece of cake to show that earlier decision-making was clearly biased in favor of development. Mm-hmm. But now because she had insisted they get feedback from the tribes, from the indigenous people, that somehow she was showing bias in their favor before any decision was even made. Mm-hmm. The regional supervisor denied that complaint. But then Forest Service and their allies in the ski industry worked in Washington, and Laura Jo West was subsequently notified that she could remain as supervisor of Coconino National Forest, but would no longer have decision-making authority on Snowbowl. They brought in somebody from the outside to do that. So there are economic business interests in here that are behind the scenes that are determining what's possible and what's not. Laura Jo West resigned a few months later because, it was clear that that top leadership in Washington no longer had confidence in her. But nonetheless, that master development plan is still on the shelf. And considering that the interests are behind that, I think that's significant.
Okay, so I'm going to backtrack just a little bit to this master development plan. What is on this? What are they trying to do?
Yeah, this new master development plan is a significant expansion plan. It's obvious their shareholders are looking, their partners, it's a partnership, are looking to increase their revenue stream by whatever means are possible. So the main emphasis that you'll notice if you see it is, it's interesting. Here's a little aside. When this was announced, we couldn't find a copy of it anywhere, and there weren't any public meetings being held about it. And then we found that a local mountain biking group had obtained a copy, and they were willing to send a copy to us.
No.
So we got to see a copy.
That's wild.
Which was disturbing.
Yeah.
Because the main thing that you'll notice is that this predicts or proposes Snowbowl becoming a much larger Four Seasons resort. There are zip lines and all sorts of mechanical devices they want to put up there, things that I'm not sure exactly things with odd titles. I forget what the name of it is, but
I'll link the master development plan in the show notes so people can look at it because they have it online and it's
good.
scary.
Yeah, it's not secret anymore.
Yeah.
But anyway, there's a lot of expansion into Four Seasons of activities, as well as increasing the ski capacity, which, look at the mountain today. Mm-hmm. There's no snow on it. It's only going to require more expanded treated wastewater snowmaking, which is in the new master development plan as well, increasing the capacity going through that system. Here's another part. It includes a cultural display. I forget exactly the name of it, but some kind of a little place which will make reference to the value that indigenous people place on this mountain. Think about the paradox there. In the midst, the irony that in the midst of this vast increase in development, and remember, indigenous people objected to this even when it was just a barely motorized ski area, before the idea of treated wastewater snowmaking was even conceived of. So let's keep that in mind, even though that became the pitched battle in 2002. We have always objected to this, always. And to expand the soft I'm going to put quotes around that, the soft sort of happy smiles of kids going down water slides and whatnot on the mountain, to expand all of that is no less a disruption of that traditional spiritual relationship that Indigenous people have with this place. It is a vast acceleration of it. Indigenous people, if to the extent that they know about this, just see this as another poke of the fingers in our eyes. So, what's happened since then? Again, that's still on the shelf. There have been no public meetings. There have been no engagement of a firm to create a EIS. It's all still sitting on the shelf. A year later, in 2021, word circulated from the Tribal Historic Preservation Office at Wallapai Nation of something that nobody had noticed, which is, I need to quickly backstep here. Once that environmental impact statement record of decision was issued in 2005, a subsequent legal process was initiated that's required by law. And that is under the National Historic Preservation Act, which is a whole different set of legislation. Obviously, environmental impact is under National Environmental Policy, what's the A stand for? Act. I've been talking a while here. Once that's in place, there needs to be a memorandum of agreement, an MOA, under National Historic Preservation Act that outlines what the commercial activity will do in the case of unexpected events that could potentially further damage traditional cultural properties. There needs to be a plan in place and agreed to, this MOA, in terms of how will communication happen between the Forest Service, the business operator, and the Indigenous entities or anybody connected to that traditional cultural property. What kind of communication will be required, and what kind of notifications will happen in the event of unanticipated adverse events? That's adverse is the word that needs to be in there. So there needs to be a process, a procedure that's already agreed to.
Memorandum of Agreement, that's what MOA stands for?
MOA,
okay.
Memorandum of Agreement, okay. Right. And so when that environmental record of decision was approved in 2005, a Memorandum of Agreement was subsequently developed. Now that Memorandum of Agreement listed 13 Native nations as signatories. On that document, there were 3 who actually signed it. There's a slight chance it's 4. My memory's a little foggy. 3 or 4 actually signed it, and one of those, Hopi, subsequently withdrew their signature, their approval of it. So how did that MOA go forward with all those blank signature lines? It went forward because all of the Indigenous nation signatories were considered what they call consulting signatories. They are not required. They can opt to be consulted, but the agreement can be accepted by the federal government without their signature. So who are the required signatories? You're going to laugh at this. The required signatories are the U.S. Forest Service, the State Office of Historic Preservation, the State Historic Preservation Officer, and the National Advisory Council, which is the federal council in Washington that oversees compliance with National Historic Preservation Act. Even Snowbowl is not a necessary signatory. So if the agency gets the signature of the State Historic Preservation Officer and the federal component thereof, those are the only required signatures.
So what's the point?
The point is,
if none of the
point is that there's a plan.
Okay. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
You
and
need something written down.
if you tribal historic preservation officers recognize deficiencies in the plan, and many of them refuse to sign just on principle. We're being asked to approve a process that's going to make it look like we approve this whole development. We're against it to begin with, and we're not going to sign anything related to it. I understand that perspective. The other perspective is, well, if you sign on there, you'll be notified in the case of adverse events. As I said, there were either 3 or 4 signatures out of the 13 on that document. Anyway, that document, it turns out, it's right there. It's a public document, but it had a 10-year life. It expired in 10 years. It expired in 2015, and nobody noticed. Forest Service didn't notice. Snowbowl didn't notice. They signed it. They didn't notice. Nobody noticed. What that means legally is that Snowbowl was not permitted to stick a shovel in the ground on any of its approved projects from 2015. Since 2015. Nobody knew about it, so people weren't going to go back and file a lawsuit based on anything that happened before that. I guess maybe it's possible, but that didn't happen. But when we were notified, that is we meaning I'm talking about Indigenous Circle of Flagstaff, a group of Indigenous people in Flagstaff who have kind of let it be known we want to help out on this issue. We were notified by Tribal Historic Preservation Office lawyer from Wallapai about this because he had discovered it in looking through the document. Oh, this thing's expired. What this meant was that Snowbowl is going to put pressure on the Forest Service to immediately create a new MOA so that they continue, because there were several projects they'd approved for that they had on a timeline where they hadn't done them yet. We're not talking about new projects. Supposedly. There's some question about that. But anyway, this seemed like to us, with ICF, Native people in Flagstaff who were given kind of a sneak preview, that this was an opportunity. Because this agreement was required, we could demand more. We could demand things in the MOA which were not part of the 2005. That is, it doesn't have to just be a photocopy of the 2005 with new signatures on it. In fact, it shouldn't be. A lot has happened since then. Climate disruption has happened since then. There are many issues that needed to be 2020. All of this is based on an environmental impact statement that was already 20 years old. To us, even that by itself means we should have a new environmental impact statement. Well, okay, this is what happened. We got together an online meeting with tribal historic preservation officers from as many of the 13 nations that we could get to agree to do that. Navajo Nation Human Rights Commission helped tremendously with setting this up and getting us contact information. So we had that meeting in November of that year, just to let everybody know there is an opportunity here, and it will be most effective if we can work together. So that started a kind of a working group. We had a follow-up call, and among most of the nations most active, Navajo was very active, Wallapai was active, Fort McDowell was active. We arranged a process was set in place whereby the Forest Service agreed to set up a formal tribal consultation process on this new MOA. Rather than to just do it administratively as they had done before, they would actually create a tribal consultation process that would involve all of the nations in being invited. This would be under Forest Service management, this process. And that began. That went on for 2 years. The meetings actually got split in two because one of the most immediate topic was we need this new MOA. But then the representatives were saying we also need to establish a tribal consultation process that will work for us in the future so that this isn't the last time we ever do this. Mm-hmm. And we need to set up the parameters of how this should be done according to us. And so a second set of meetings was held along that line. Those meetings on tribal consultation were considered government-to-government meetings. They were not under National Historic Preservation Act. So as a representative of Indigenous Circle Flagstaff, I wasn't invited to those meetings, but I got Navajo Nation to invite me as a guest. So at least I could stay informed about it, but I wasn't really permitted to speak.
Sure.
It didn't stop me entirely, but but the MOA meetings were under National Historic Preservation Act, and that meant that it was not just for Native nations, it was for other what they call traditional authorities, like the Medicine Peoples Association were also part of those meetings, Navajo Medicine Men's Association, and they were the ones that most consistently participated. But even us as Indigenous Circle Flagstaff were allowed to sit as ourselves in those meetings. Fast forward, those meetings went on for 2 years. I can't speak about the tribal consultation meetings because I very quickly was unable to keep up with that. But I did try to continue to go to the other meetings on the MOA. When I became chair of my department, my life changed. But anyway, I kept in touch with people that were going to those meetings. What came to a head was a pretty drastic disagreement. The tribal representatives, the Indigenous Nation representatives, were consistent, uniform, and united. Were united that there must be a provision for monitoring of the effects of that accumulation of treated wastewater on the soil and plant communities on the mountain and downslope from the ski area. We had evidence that there was, by the way, that effluent was the runoff was going beyond the permit area, which is not allowed under the Snowbowl's permit. There was very clear evidence, and we have geologists who's documented that amply. We also have a scientist who has studied the effects of accumulated treated wastewater on other kinds of developments in Florida. And the evidence is startling.
We talked to Alan on our...
You talked to him. Okay, he's been on a previous... Okay, so I don't need to say any more about that. So these are serious issues. We're not just making up things to be concerned about. And yet that's how it's been received. So the nations were demanding that some kind of provision for monitoring be included in the new MOA. This can't wait. We kept being told, well, when we do a new master development plan or when we do forest management plan amendments further down the road, we can talk about this. Obviously, they were under pressure from the resort to get this out of the way as quickly as possible and to avoid the bad publicity that would come from knowing that, hey, they're monitoring. What are they monitoring up there? Why are they monitoring it? Because you can imagine that kind of tips the hand that there is some reason for being concerned about this. This is the only place in the world where this is happening. And it's like how many millions of gallons of that stuff is being sprayed, every month when they're in season. And this has been going on for how many years? 2012, 20 years. No, 10 years. And that's accumulating in the soil. And guess what? One of the demonstrated results of that is that indigenous plant species adapted to low moisture summers will be displaced by invasive species who are opportunistically feeding on all that nitrogen and phosphorus that we're pumping on the ground. They will displace the indigenous species, including those medicine plants. Not only that, these will be fast-growing invasive plants that will dry up and burn. the fire danger will increase, as if it's not bad enough already. So all of that is not just, imagination. There's data to back it up. And yet the Forest Service, after going through 2 years of consultation, they met every damn month. Excuse me. They met every month for 2 years. And the result was an MOA that basically looked like the 2005 MOA that had no monitoring provisions in it whatsoever. They worked hard to try to get tribal Native Nation signatures, and in the end that thing was published in June of this past year with 0 signatures. It was, they didn't even get the 3 or 4 that they got in 2005. There are no signatures on it. Once again, because the Native signatories were not required, they were irrelevant. After 2 years, we're told, well, actually, we don't need your permission. I know that in the U.S. Forest Service, there are examples elsewhere where tribal consultation and tribal co-management is being implemented. In Northern California, the Yurok tribe has an agreement with Forest Service up there. They are taking the lead in managing those lands and rivers in particular. So those directives, there are these executive orders that have been coming ever since the Clinton administration, but again in the Obama administration. There's a interagency agreement with Forest Service, which is under Department of Agriculture, and the Interior Department to work together to make sure, to do everything possible to consult with Indigenous people and make sure that Indigenous knowledge and science is included in their decision making, and that traditional cultural properties are protected. That's all there as a directive. These agencies are being directed to do this from the top level. What's not there are all the specific rules and practices and in terms of how to actually do that. Most mid-level leadership officials in federal agencies are going to be very slow to take action without specific parameters as to what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do. So in most cases, those top-level directives just sit there as, that'd be nice to do. Yeah, sure would, wouldn't it? When I asked Laura Jo West about this, about why she decided to take that 2020 Master Development Plan and put it on the shelf, she said, I was aware of all those top-level directives, and I was aware that I didn't have specific guidelines as to how to implement them. So I said, let's be creative. Let's step out of our box and actually do things differently. I think that's what they did up in I forget which national forest it is in Northern California where they came to that agreement with the Yuroks. What we're talking about now is bear ears as an example, but that was done through congressional legislation to set up the intertribal national monument. And they were still, the last I heard, they were still working on the specifics of how the tribal co-management was going to work there. And of course, now with this new administration, we don't know if all that's going to, how much of that will even survive. Another podcast, right? But in this case, we see that the Coconino National Forest and the Southwest Region of National Forest Service have held to their line. They have gone through what I personally see as the motions of a tribal consultation process, only to shut the door, when it was most critical. The whole purpose of this was to develop an MOA. To me, it's like, okay, we love everything you've told us, but we're going to ignore it. And they can tell you why, or this policy doesn't, a lot of reasons are given for why this is not practical at this time, and we'll keep it on our radar for the next time we get together. So that's where things pretty much stand today. I mean, if I had to summarize this, I have to say we are going to continue this fight. We and the people coming after us are going to continue this. We're never going to give up on this. We're going to put tremendous pressure on the city of Flagstaff come 2030, in the years leading up to 2034. ICF has sat down with city council members. I don't think we've ever heard anyone say, oh, yeah, I'm going to vote for that thing when it comes up again. Everyone that we've talked to has said, no, I wouldn't have voted for it then, and I won't vote for it if I'm still around when it comes up. But that's not a guarantee.
Right.
It's easy to say that when you have a constituent, sitting in front of you. Yeah. But, I think that's going to be a future opportunity, because if that contract is not renewed, Snowbowl completely changes. Right. Without that treated wastewater, they're no longer a full-time ski resort. Yeah. And the new Four Seasons stuff in the new master development plan, that's still on the shelf. So, you can be sure the public will be, I don't know what to say. We'll definitely be testifying when that comes up again, but we did that in 2002 as well. Right, yeah. But I do think the environment in Flagstaff has changed. The political, social, environmental awareness in Flagstaff is way different now than it was in 2002. Mm-hmm. It's not just going to be Indigenous people saying, no, this is not the time for this. Yeah. Whether it's enough, I don't know. Yeah. Up until now, I got to say, in terms of the legal and policy context, it's still the same. Judges, consistently rule in favor of the rights of property and profit whenever they conflict with Indigenous people and their reverence and practices around sacred beings. So I think that if there's going to be a release of that burden on this sacred being here, that's going to have to happen politically more than, it's much more likely to happen politically than legally. Yeah.
All right, thanks again for joining us today and listening to our chat with Chris. I hope that today's episode played another role in helping provide a more complete picture around Snowbowl Ski Resort and how what is happening has been allowed to happen. To learn more and to stay connected, follow us on social media at Protect Grand Canyon, listed in the show notes, and follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And consider sharing these episodes with others and possibly giving us a 5-star review if you are willing. Every episode and story shared is another step towards protecting these sacred places for generations to come. For questions or to get involved locally, don't hesitate to email me at mattea.goetz@sierraclub.org, also listed in the show notes. I also want to share a huge thank you and shout out to our partners at Beyond the Pines, a local wellness collective here in Flagstaff, created to promote connection and service of human and planetary thriving. And you can find their podcast at Beyond FLG and on their website and Instagram, also at Beyond FLG. And until next time, may you find a deeper connection to the land and wild places around you.